Welcome to a special edition of the Under the Sisterhood podcast, Women Making History, during Women's History Month. We will celebrate 6 women and focus our conversations on each woman's life-changing contributions. This is a podcast to celebrate women and all that they do in our world. I'm Elizabeth Elfenbein. Let's get under the hood. Today, we're celebrating Women Making History with the inspiring Dr. Dale Atkins. Dale Atkins is a licensed psychologist with more than 40 years of experience as a relationship expert focusing on families, wellness, managing stress, and developing compassion for resilience needed to live a balanced, meaningful life. Author of 7 books and numerous chapters, articles, and journals for popular and professional audiences, Dale is a featured speaker who lectures and leads seminars worldwide. For her entire career, she has served as a guest expert, consultant to the media, and for 22 years appeared as a regular guest expert on NBC's Today and CNN. She created and hosted Dr. Dale's Life Issues, a 48-episode talk show series about relationships broadcasted on JTN and PBS. Dale has a private psychology practice in New York City and has been a member and an advisor to several nonprofit national boards, whose focus are literacy, tolerance, women's health, wellness, child protection, and community action. She is particularly proud of her 25-year association with Jumpstart for young children, from whose board she recently retired after serving 22 years since its founding, and for whom she served as the National Spokesperson for the Read for the Record initiative launched on NBC's Today Show. Additionally, she is an active founding board member of WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters. Dale has been recognized locally and nationally for her philanthropic work and is the recipient of several awards for her community service and leadership. Among these are the Distinguished Alumni Award from Teachers College, Columbia University's Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, the YWCA's Brava Award, Jewish Women's Foundation Women Who Inspire Award, Harmony with No Limits Spirit of Leadership Award, Jumpstart for Young Children's Leadership Award, and the Anti-Defamation League's Leadership Award. Dale has 2 children and 6 grandchildren and lives in Connecticut, and she and her dog Samson are a dog therapy team.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is such a joy to be with you. And congratulations on everything you're doing with Under the Sisterhood, bringing women together.
This is a really interesting series. It's Women Making History. So if it's okay, let's get going.
I'm looking forward to talking with you. It's great.
So this is a question, and it's a pretty open-ended question, but it really begins our conversation, which is, what was the journey that inspired you to get into psychology?
My journey actually changed from what I had originally thought because of a skiing accident. And sometimes, when things happen in your life, you continue along your path, and sometimes you're encouraged to go on another path. And for me, I was encouraged to go on a path that had to do more with the internal life of a person. And I started that journey with in the field of special education. You mentioned Teachers College, and I had received my master's in what was then called Education of the Deaf. And I was very, very interested in working with children and their families, children who really couldn't communicate in the way that most of the world was communicating, and trying to deal with the family issues. And that led me on my path to, I felt that I had known quite a lot about what was called special education in those days, but I wanted to know more about, what's like in a normal family. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, what's the word normal mean anyway? And I wanted to learn more about child development. And then that led me to family systems and family interaction. And before I knew it, I was really getting involved in psychology, more from a developmental standpoint. And then that led into family relationships, communications, choices that we make, dealing with adversity, dealing with what makes us resilient. All of these things converged, but they were actually all along the path. But when I was a very little girl, there was a show, a television show called Dr. Joyce Brothers. And Dr. Joyce Brothers was a psychologist, and I would race home from my half day of school, and I'd set up my desk, and she would read letters that people would write to her, and then she would give her advice. And I used to sit there at my desk watching her, and as the letters would be read, I would give my advice. I might have been 8 or 10. Interestingly, though, as a psychologist, you're not so much, unless you're on television, giving advice. You're really listening to where people are and helping them go into their own lives and figure out what works for them. So you're not really an advice giver. You're really more of a guide or a sounding board. So perhaps that answers the question about the initial journey.
There's a lot that you said in that little bit. You find this interest in special education. What was that moment? And then what was that bit of time like?
I would have to say that I was sensitized to children who were different. There were people in our family who had physical disabilities, and I was observing. I don't think I was consciously observing, but I was observing how they were in our family, and then how the external world looked at them and treated them. And there was a real disconnect. And I thought that was so unfair. So when I ended up in a hospital myself, rehabbing, and as I got better, I was able to volunteer. And I volunteered with people who had had strokes and people who had disabilities from injury. One of my volunteer posts was I was sent to a ward in a hospital, and there were a couple of children there who didn't have normal hearing, and nobody could talk to them. Nobody was trying to talk to them. Nobody could talk to them. It was really very sad. And I wondered, they weren't there because of their hearing loss. They were there because of a physical, illness that brought them to the hospital. And that really sensitized me to issues having to do with communication and connection. And so when I went to a graduate program, and there's a lot that happened before that. I was traveling a lot. I was working with a family whose little girl had a learning disability, and the family was denying that she was learning differently, and she was failing in school, and it was very troublesome to me. And so I decided to apply to graduate school, and that's how that started. And then I was most concerned with the sibling relationships in families where there were children who were different, the grandparent relationships, the maternal stress. And that actually, on a very circuitous route, led me to write my first book, which interestingly was called Sisters, since we're talking about under the sisterhood.
What I find very interesting, Dale, is going back to your comment from the very beginning, and then you just mentioned it again, is looking at people instead of externally, looking inwardly and on the inside. You must have been a real outlier in ways other than maybe within your programs. I mean, so you went off to school for your master's. What was that like?
Well, I was an outlier because in the graduate program where I was, there were very few people who didn't have an immediate, one removed person in their family who had a disability. It was called a disability in those days. I was and am extremely interested in our backgrounds and our family stories, in how we become who we are, the nature nurture, but also how we are energetically, how we respond to people who may intimidate us, who may envelop us in positive and negative ways. Often these people are in our families, and often they determine, in great part, how we engage ourselves in the world. When I went and finished my doctoral degree, which was in early childhood and developmental studies, and also working in clinical psychology, I was very, very interested, not so much in teaching, although I love to teach, not so much in research, although I love research. I was doing that, but I also wanted to share some of the knowledge that I was gaining in a more public way. So even before I finished my degree, I was invited to comment on what was then Cable Health Network, which turned out to be a very large network, but it was in the beginning of cable news. And, I talk about things that had to do with health and wellness impacting our psychological well-being. It's just so interesting because I thought it was interesting. I was working in a program which was a center for children who had hearing loss and their parents. They were very, very young children. And I was wanting to focus on the sibling relationships. I wanted to focus on what was happening in the family. There was a lot that had to do with culture. In certain cultures, we are more willing to have children who are different. In others, we are not willing. Mothers-in-law would blame their daughters-in-law if a child was born with a difference. And you can't not pay attention to the impact of all of the forces that have an impact on us.
As you said, you're in the mainstream now, but you thought differently back then. Now it's suddenly acceptable. But the truth is where you were is where we are today. It's kind of ironic that it's finally acceptable. So do you talk a little bit about that?
I appreciate the question, and I think it has been the journey. Things change, and we have to change, and we have to know what is central to who we are in the work that we're doing and what we're going to stand up to and what is less important. And, sometimes getting in the door, I remember when I wrote Sisters, there was a whole chapter on losing a sister, the death of a sister. Now, I wrote Sisters in 1984, and I remember that the publisher, they said, well, we can't talk about death. We can't talk about the death of a sibling because that's just too heavy. And I said to myself and to everybody involved, it's part of life. Death is part of life. And it came down to, we're not going to publish the book if you insist on putting the chapter about death in it. And it was a real moment for me. It was my first book. I had just graduated from graduate school. I had done these seminars all over the country. No one had done anything like it. This was the information that I had gathered. A lot of it was from my dissertation, which was what kicked off the idea for the book. And I had to swallow. And I said, its time will come, but I will publish the book. And I published the book and then did different kinds of seminars. And the first show that I was on was a show called The Phil Donahue Show. And the audience, although maybe, yes. And then right after that, I did Oprah, who at the time, it was the Oprah Winfrey Show. She wasn't the Oprah she is now. But my point is that we filled the audience with women, many of whom had lost sisters. And so I talked about the impact of losing a sister in an audience and with a reach that was far greater than I ever could have imagined. And it allowed me to open up a conversation that I was stopped from doing in the book, but yet, I guess, giving that up in order to get the book out there and then have the conversation at a totally different venue was worth it. And I think that the lesson for me now, as I look back on it, and I appreciate your asking, because I don't know that I was so conscious of it, was, what is your goal? Was my goal to write a book about losing a sibling? Or was my goal to write a book about sisters' relationships and the myriad experiences that we have as sisters of all different ages at all different points of life? And everyone knows that there's death as part of life. It will come out. So you have to know, or what I had to learn was, what do you hang on to and what do you give up? Are you still in pursuit of your goal? And sometimes goals change, and they change because doors do not open. but then other doors open. You just have to figure out a different way in. I knew that I wanted to have more of a varied career in the world of psychology. And this was one way to kind of be out there a little bit more. And I never really perceived myself as a writer, but writing was always very difficult for me. It still is, even after 7 books and lots of other writing, it's not easy, but I enjoy it, but it certainly is not easy for me.
I love the fact that you kept your career very varied. And I think it is important you acknowledged your age is 75. Why I think it's so remarkable is the way you think today, the fact that you are both brilliant and wise and able to teach the next generation just by sheer role modeling. But what I also find fascinating is where you were, as I said, so ahead of the time at such a young age. So that's why I was bringing up the age, because it really suggests just both a prolific career, hence women making history, but also it suggests the wisdom side of things. So talk a little bit about the 7 books.
People much wiser than I always suggest that you write what you know. I write what I think I know and what I'd like to learn more about. And that's worked for me. So the first book was Sisters. I have a wonderful sister. My sister's relationship was extremely impactful for me. I'm a younger sister. Writing my dissertation, I was very interested in the impact that older sisters had in families where there were younger children who had some kind of a disability. Were those sisters expected to take on more responsibilities? Did they get less parental attention? I mean, there's a chapter in the book, Sisters by Birth or by Choice. What you're doing with Under the Sisterhood, we all have sisters by choice. These are, women who we feel like sisters to. And some of us had very good relationships with our sisters. Others had not so good. Some had awful. They change, they don't change. I was fascinated by that. The next book that I wrote was called From the Heart. Why? Because I got married. And it was a book, and I married, which at the time was considered late. I was just shy of my 40th birthday, and I was married for the first time. And I wanted to know, what was it like to be married? So a colleague of mine and I, we solicited and collected almost 100 letters written by people who were married, all different kinds of marriages, because the marriage that you usually use as a model, whether it's a positive or negative model, is your parents' marriage. If you had 2 parents that you knew, whether it was a healthy marriage, an unhealthy marriage, a divorce, whether you're raised by a single parent, what is your model of marriage? So we solicited, as I said, and edited and commented on these many types of all the different ways that you could be married. And then I went through a stage, and a lot of this was reflective also of what I was doing in my work, in my actual psychological work. The next book I wrote was called I'm Okay, You're My Parents, and that was written in 2004. And my father had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease when he was about 63, and he was a very, very young and vital man. And this was in the 1990s. There was very little known about Alzheimer's, as I said before. There was, one book that people used as a handbook. It was called the 36-Hour Day. And there was nothing for children. There was very little for families. And so that's when really my life changed remarkably and forever, because what I witnessed in our own family and in other families were people needed loving caregiving as they were declining, whether the declination was a cognitive declination, whatever it was incredibly instructive to me. And what I learned and what I try to and still try to share is you have to go where people are. And in my case, it had to do with going down a very strange and unwelcoming rabbit hole where my father spent a lot of time. And people would look at us like we were crazy, and it didn't matter because he felt safe and I felt connected. And so those lessons that I learned during my father's illness are the lessons that I still share and write about. And they're not unique to Alzheimer's, but they are very relevant to families with Alzheimer's. And that really turned and set me on my caregiving route. So many years later, my dad's been gone almost 30 years.
If that was 30 years ago, you were just so the right person for your father to spend that time with, to be seen, heard on his terms, to hear that, and to just know that you were there 30 years ago. I am guessing that isn't just your experience as a psychologist, it's just who you are inside. It's an intuitive, it's a nature, right?
You're very kind. It's extremely hard to watch someone you love change in these dramatic ways. At the same time, when we focus on what's left rather than what's not there, and we find the areas that are still active and can be vibrant, they really can be vibrant. For instance, my dad and I used to sing together, and there were certain songs that he sang all the time, and we just sang them over and over again. And rather than say, oh my God, here we go again, I liken it to, opening night at Broadway, because for the actors, they're doing the same thing over and over and over every night, every night, every night. But for the person in the audience, it's like opening night. He's so happy because he's singing his favorite song. Who am I to bring my reality into his, which will diminish him and will degrade the quality of the interaction? So I think that, adapting to where someone is, I will share with you one of the most troubling experiences, which was such a life lesson. I went to visit my dad one day. My dad was home with my mom, and we had a wonderful care person, and I was with him, and I would go and see him a lot. And we had to cover the mirrors, because he would see people, he would hallucinate, and he would see people, or maybe he saw himself and got scared. So he couldn't watch television. So anything with a screen was off limits. So we were standing somewhere, and I said, Dad, oh, here we are together. And he said, watch out, there's someone here and he's got a knife. Now, prior to this particular visit, which by the way was inspired by listening to Dr. Oliver Sacks, whom I had heard before one of the visits to my dad. He had just written the book Awakenings, which was made into a movie with Robin Williams. And he spoke about his experience of going into the lives of people who had been comatose for years and came alive. They had awakenings. And I left that experience with a whole new insight. So when I was with my dad and he was telling me about these people who were going to kill us, and I would say, no, 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 Daddy, nobody's here, nobody's here. Something clicked. And Elizabeth, I went into the kitchen and I picked up a kitchen knife and I started stabbing the air around us. And I said, yes, I've got them, I'm killing them. And he was so relaxed until 2 seconds later when he was agitated again. So I brought out the knife again. One could really argue that that might not have been the wisest choice of behavior, but it worked. And he was no longer agitated, and we were fine. And we could go to have our next experience, which was gentle and kind and funny. And when he became scared again, I knew what to do, because denying his reality was not going to help him. I think that there are so many lessons that can be generalized to everyday life with our children. You were asking, so what was the next book? The next book was I'm Okay, You're My Parents. And it was, how do you take care of parents? How do you take care of yourself before you're in the caregiver role? How can you examine and let go the problems that you've had with your adult parents before you might be in a position of taking care of them? And it has to do with internal work. It doesn't have to do with why won't my parents change? Your parents aren't changing. What are you going to do about yourself to
Interesting.
have a relationship? And then after that, I wrote a book called Wedding Sanity Savers because I was kind of like the Dear Abby of weddingchannel.com.
Oh dear.
And I just kept reading about all of these family dynamics that played out in advance of a wedding. And that was actually fun and led to another book called Sanity Savers, which is really tips for women to live a balanced life. And then I wrote the book about kindness, the Kindness Advantage.
Yeah, I was really actually taken aback by even you thinking about the kindness advantage, particularly in the world we're living in today.
That's why we wrote it.
Exactly. So I would love for you to share a little bit about, well, obviously the inspiration's the inspiration, but talk a little bit about it.
The Kindness Advantage I co-authored with my niece, Amanda Salzauer. And I had been doing a series of talks about raising philanthropic children, generous children, charitable children. And I thought that that was going to be my next book. And then I realized that what does it take to be a charitable person? And one of the most important elements is kindness. And at the time, this was 2018, kids already had phones. Kids were already online. Kids were doing a lot of bullying online. You know, in the olden days when kids got bullied, they came home and they had a safe space in their homes. That's no longer the case because, you know, with kids having their online connections, they don't feel safe, and it's 24/7 that kids can be bullied. And then we were having role models who were far from kind, thinking it was valuable to demean people, to devalue people, to alienate people. And it was too much for me. It was actually too much for me. And I wanted to write something that had to do with really how do you raise kind children? What is it about? We are born with a tendency to be altruistic, to be kind, to be inclusive. We are also born with a tendency to look at the other and say, oh, that's interesting or that's different, but we're not born with a tendency to hate someone else. This happens by role modeling and teaching and fear. And kids aren't mean. Why don't we look at our society and then see what it is we want to value, and what are your values, and how are you living your values, and what are the messages that we're giving to our children? And so, you know, it took us 5 years to write that little book, but in the interim, a lot happened in our country. And when we were going out talking about the book, people would say, how did you write it so fast? We said, the world changed around. It was going in a direction and it continued in that direction. And now I feel more strongly than ever that the need for recognizing each other's humanity, connecting with each other, listening to each other, understanding that we are not meant to be bifurcated and divisive. We are meant to be collaborative. We are meant to be connected. And we can get over differences. We can get through them if we really look at each other's humanity, if we dehumanize one another. There's very little hope that we will be able to be psychologically and physically well as a community.
I love the impetus that drove you to write it. I mean, it's so interesting. The title itself, The Kindness Advantage, is such a contrast to what's going on politically and in our society. So it's so interesting that you were kind of making a political statement in a soft, kind of powerful way.
I appreciate that, because when you really look at, you know, the shift in business practices and in so many areas, and you know this from your work, working with so many companies and working with people all over the world, kindness is what people appreciate. Kindness is what people value. Kindness is what draws people to each other in a family, in a community. And kindness is what makes a difference. It's compassion, it's empathy. We're all connected. And once we forget that, we're in trouble.
Kindness
Yes.
creates culture. and it's either culture or the lack thereof. And I don't mean cultures like a foreign culture. I mean the environment you're in.
What is the culture of this business? What is the culture of the school? What is the culture?
I mean, I love this. This is very meaningful to me personally. I've always, I have 3 children, and I think the thing I'm most proud of, the 3 of them, is that they are kind, good, heart and soulful people. Just hearing and talking about this it really speaks to me. And I think it speaks to what we're doing with Under the Sisterhood, because we're trying to bring and unify women and lift each other up and understand, to your point, kindness is an advantage. I want to move on and talk a little bit. You've done so much philanthropic work. What motivated you there, and what got you excited about some of that work?
I was raised in a family where you had to serve. I mean, you had to give back. My parents were very active in our communities. It was just who you were. If you were fortunate enough, and each of us is fortunate in some way, and it doesn't have to be about money. I mean, we each have a talent we can offer. We each have a moment of time. I realized that if you want to make change, sometimes you have to have a voice on a board. And I was very, very, very disturbed by the discrepancy in literacy rates of very young children who were in underserved communities as compared to very young children who were in more generously served communities. And the children whose literacy is subpar often drop out of school, often take paths that lead towards incarceration. And it's because they don't have books. They don't have access to reading. It's not that their parents don't want to read to them. Their parents want to read to them. Their parents are often very, very busy, having 2 or 3 jobs. And they may not be within walking distance of a library. There may not be somebody to take them. Very young children having books is essential to the development of literacy skills. And friends of mine were starting an organization called Jumpstart for young children. And they were 4 young people who had graduated from college and worked at a camp, and they decided they had this idea, and they came and they asked my husband and me if we would help support it and introduce them to a few people, which we did. And then they were very kind, and they asked if I would have some impact and input. I said, sure. Well, I fell in love with the organization from its very beginning. And it's a major national organization that really continues to have an impact. And I think that if you're lucky enough to be able to go on a board, you go on a board whose purpose is something you're passionate about. For many years in my career, I worked with children who suffered sexual abuse. And I wrote a curriculum, I co-wrote a prevention curriculum for children who were at risk. And these were typically young children who had disabilities. And the curriculum was called No Go Tell. And it was a long time ago. And very few people were talking about sexual abuse, and certainly not of little children. And so I found myself on, advocacy programs for that community. I'm very active in the world of anti-Semitism, anti-hate, bigotry. It makes me crazy what's going on, particularly now. And I think that if you have a passion about something and you have a voice, then you use your voice. I'm very interested in women's health. A dear friend started an organization from another organization. I was involved in it. She had this vision. It's taken off, not unlike you. You follow your passion, you do something. I love that Under the Sisterhood has sisterhood. You are trying to, and you have accomplished, doing something that makes an impact and doing something that impacts people in a charitable, philanthropic way that can change lives. So, I pray to God that I'm healthy enough to be able to serve in different ways as I get older.
So I couldn't agree more with you in terms of we have a social responsibility as humans to serve and help each other. It's really a wonderful thing to be able to hear your story and to be able to celebrate it with so many women and to inspire the next generation and this generation to say, hey, you can do something. What is it that you want to do? And the thing that I think's been very interesting, not just in this conversation, from several conversations that we've had in our various ways, is that you do it so organically. It's like it's from the heart with you. It's really deeply embedded. And so I just want to acknowledge that because I think it's really important. You're not scripted, Dale. You know, you're you're your
Thank
authentic
you.
at all times. And so is there anything you want to say about that?
A lot. I think that I guess because my route was a different route, there were times when I wondered if I really was qualified, even though I knew I was qualified. At some point, you say, this works, this is really good, and or this doesn't work. Let me learn more about that. I guess what I want to respond is, I think you always have to keep learning. And you always have to be curious. And some things that work, but this is true for life, some things that worked when you were 30 don't work when you're 60. And if you keep doing them, that's probably not a good idea. But you can modify things. You can either let things go and say, that was nice and that worked for then. But now I'm interested in this. I mean, I'll give you an example. A person called me just a few days ago and asked if I would interview an author. And I said, oh, I love doing that. And when she asked me this, she said, well, what do you like about it? And I said, I love everything about interviewing an author because there's a finite period of time from the time that I begin my research and end my research. And there's a culmination. There's a discovery, there's a curiosity, who is this person and why did he or she write this book? And what are they saying? And what do they want to learn? And this and that. And then I try to get the context. And then give this person an opportunity to do more than just read from their book, but to talk about how writing that book has changed them or impacted them or where they're going next. And then, shining a light on them, which I think is great. And then it's over. Like, well, that was really great. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. I'm intellectually stimulated. I'm engaged with the person, which I really like. And if I can help that person get their message in a way or to a different audience, I love it. So she said, well, gee, that's great. Would you like to do more of those? I said, yeah, I think I would. So in order to do that, then something else is going to be put aside for a while. And that's okay, because there are certain things that I'm doing that I'm enjoying, but I think I'd like to do this more. And when you get to be this age, you realize that you really don't have, another 50 years, but I'm very conscious of each moment and what each moment can bring. And also I'm very conscious of what's good for my well-being at this point in my life. When I was a very young woman, I started meditating and I started doing yoga. I was very young. I was, the end of my teen years, and it's helped me a lot in my life. And there are certain times when I'm more intense about certain things, but I know that it helped me. I was always very conscious of how I was eating. My choice. I've been a vegetarian for over 50 years, and I feel that that's healthy for me. And, I'm not going out proselytizing, but those are choices that I made when I was younger that still work for me. And there are other choices that don't work for me so well.
Thank you for sharing that, for sharing all of this. But we are coming to a close with this conversation. And so what would you like to leave with other women?
Well, thank you for honoring me in this way. I'd like women in particular to develop a sense of love for themselves and compassion for themselves, particularly when we wonder if we're in the right space or doing the right thing or said the right thing, to really have compassion when we mess up and say, what did I learn from that? And to have confidence and to try to be with people who really support you and to share your gift, whatever they are, with other women and men as well, but we're all role models, and to behave in a way that you want people to behave with you, and to really appreciate who you are and what your gifts are, because we all have so many gifts, and sometimes the people who raise us not only don't recognize them, but don't value them. That doesn't mean that they're not recognizable and not valuable. There's an inner voice that each of us have, and to quiet the noise and try to make room for that voice is a very important thing to do. And it can take a lifetime, but it's a very interesting journey when you keep tuning in and listening to what that voice is trying to say to you. And when we tone down the critical voice, we have more room to amplify the encouraging voice, the compassionate voice, the curious voice, the wonderful, wonderful voice. And I guess that would be my message at this moment. And to not be afraid of aging. It's a privilege to be able to get older. And we live in a culture that often belittles certainly the outside appearance of aging. And you know, when we age well from the inside, it'll all take care of itself.
Wow. I mean, what a wonderful message. I want to leave with saying that you have been an extraordinary role model to women out there, to men out there for so many years. And I'm just so thrilled to be celebrating you as a woman making history. Thank you so much, Dr. Dale Atkins. Go on to drdaleatkins.com, but you are extraordinary. Thank you for getting under the hood with me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer. Her song, Rose.